Okay, so we're going to move to our next speaker now, focusing on low carbon solutions. Please welcome everyone, the Technical Director, Energy and Climate Change from Mott MacDonald, Sam Friggens.
Kia ora koutou. Lovely to be here today, and thank you to Ainsley and the ISC for the invitation to speak to you. I would like to use the next 10 minutes to share an example of infrastructure industry collaboration on net zero from the UK. I've been myself here in Aotearoa for about 9 months with Mott MacDonald, but prior to that I was in the UK. And by net zero, I'm referring to the state at which humanity's net emissions to the atmosphere are zero. And we need to achieve that to stop global warming. And that requires a rapid elimination of emissions from all parts of the economy, and where that really can't happen, to counterbalance that effectively by taking an equivalent amount of gases out of the atmosphere. And the key message that I would like to get across today is that I think net zero is best seen not as a target or something that we do at a project or even an organisational level, but as an urgent, complex societal transformation over the next 30 years that will impact all sectors and many parts of our lives. So it's a process as much as it is an endpoint. And within that, clearly infrastructure and buildings have a critical role to play, both because they have long asset lifetimes, but also because of the greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with infrastructure and the activities that infrastructure enables. In 2019, in the UK, the government legislated for a new national net zero emissions target by 2050, strengthening our Climate Change Act from what was an 80% reduction. And the UK's Climate Change Commission at the same time had set out broadly what that means for infrastructure delivery. We need to double our electricity supply, all from clean energy, along with associated major grid upgrades. We need to build a new hydrogen economy. We need to build new zero-carbon industrial clusters with carbon capture and storage. We need to retrofit nearly 30 million buildings with clean heat and deep efficiency, and the list goes on. And so this represents a major transformation for which there are few historical precedents. So this was a very exciting time. And along with some colleagues at Mott MacDonald, we wanted to contribute to this and play the best role we could in support of this agenda. So we convened a group of infrastructure industry partners that we worked with the goal of harnessing our collective expertise in delivering infrastructure at scale around the world to bring that to bear in support of the government's target to work across industry. And we wanted to focus on the practical aspects of how to deliver net zero infrastructure. We wanted to make a substantial analytical contribution and not just be a talking shop. And we wanted to answer some of the big questions about net zero. And our membership has grown over time. You can see that that includes asset owners, local government, consultants, contractors. So really it brings a very diverse range of perspectives. And the model for this coalition is very loose. We are very light on governance and structure. There are no financial contributions, but each organisation offers what it can in terms of expertise and resources, and volunteers to lead work packages that suit it. And I wanted to highlight just a couple of key principles that underpin the coalition's work. The first is systems thinking. There are a number of dimensions to this, but we wanted to recognise the increasing interconnectedness between different infrastructure sectors, perhaps best exemplified between electricity, heat, and transport. We wanted to recognise the interconnectedness between the built environment as a whole and other systems, such as our natural environment, our social systems, and our digital systems. And we wanted to situate our contribution within a multi-level framework that sees assets as sitting within networks and systems that are bounded by governance and regulation at different levels. And the second key principle that we wanted to underpin our work was to challenge the way we thought about infrastructure delivery. And specifically, we wanted to focus not just on how we build new infrastructure well, as important as that is, but we wanted to challenge the need for new infrastructure in the first place and the need for carbon-generating activities. And this idea is encapsulated well in this graphic from the new PAS 2080 specification. It also touches on work by the IPCC and others. But it presents a hierarchy of decision-making from avoid to switch to improve. And I think there's quite a radical idea behind this chart because it requires us to engage with the demand side and people and behaviours and how to facilitate different choices to reduce the need for infrastructure. So I'm going to touch now on a few case studies of our work. The first example is a work stream we undertook looking at place-based approaches to net zero. So this was originally undertaken in 2021 in the UK, but it was updated last year for an Australia, New Zealand audience in partnership with the ISE. And this really looked at the critical role of cities in net zero and set out a framework for collaboration between government, businesses and communities. And it was a call to recognise the uniqueness of different places, the specific strengths and weaknesses of communities, and to empower cities to lead. And we found in terms of impact, this has been an invaluable tool for engaging in more intelligent discussions about the role of cities, and it's been used by some of the UK cities to shape their climate change agenda, such as the Manchester Climate Change Agency. The second example is a work stream that looked at pathways to zero carbon heat in the UK. And the question here, how do we turn off fossil gas to heat buildings within 3 decades? And to address this question, we used analysis undertaken by the UK's Climate Change Commission, which identified 3 2050 scenarios: electrification, hydrogen and hybrid. And we worked back to develop infrastructure delivery roadmaps that considered key decision points, supply chain requirements and interconnections. And this made a valuable contribution by identifying key activities that are needed in the short term, regardless of the long-term scenario. And that work has been successful in the sense that it's informed the work of the Climate Change Commission and the government's heat and building strategy. But in all honesty, the UK is lagging still on heat decarbonisation. We have a long way to go. And the third example is a work stream that looked at the embodied carbon of a net zero infrastructure pipeline. So we looked at the UK's pipeline for the next 10 years, about £600 billion worth of investment, and we wanted to know what contribution does building that infrastructure make to our carbon budgets. But the key finding here was that we couldn't really answer that question because across the industry as a whole, there is currently fairly poor quality data and poor transparency and reporting of that data. And so that finding is fed into work now by the UK's Infrastructure Projects Authority in setting out its new approach to whole life carbon in infrastructure. So overall, the coalition, I think, has been successful externally in the impact and influence we've had, but also internally in helping us to mobilise our colleagues and helping us to understand what net zero really means. I just want to finish by offering a few observations on New Zealand from my 9 months here. In terms of the big picture, I think this is pretty positive. New Zealand has a Net Zero Act, a target, a Climate Change Commission, carbon budgets, climate risk disclosure, and this is all great stuff. But I think there is a question about how that translates to a genuine all-of-government approach to net zero. And I'm thinking, for example, about the resource management reforms, and also if there's the political and societal will to transfer the targets into action. In terms of collaboration, this, I think, is also in a good place. I've been really struck by the culture which enables knowledge sharing and learning between organisations, and I've seen that through some of the work I've done with organisations to build carbon into decision making. But perhaps there's a question there about what more we can do to collaborate to really support this agenda. And finally, in terms of systems thinking, I think this is a challenge here in Aotearoa, as it is everywhere, particularly the issue of the demand side and how we engage people in different choices and behaviours. We like to build things, governments like to build things. It can be different for politicians to go to places that are seen as infringing on the private domain. But the evidence from the IPCC, the IEA, and others shows that there is no viable path to net zero by mid-century without including people as a really critical part of that. So we can't build our way to net zero, and I would be wary of any claims to net zero that rely overly on technical or technological solutions. So I will finish there. Thank you for listening, and be pleased to answer any questions.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Okay, while I get this going, can I just ask you, Sam, you talked about societal transformation. What might that look like in reality? You know, outside of this room, outside of the experts, what would people notice?
So that is a very good question. I think from an infrastructure perspective, in terms of decarbonisation, we've tended to focus at the moment on the things that we can't see have made a tangible difference to our lives. In the UK, at least, we focused on how we decarbonise our electricity supply. You know, we've switched from fossil fuels to renewables, and we're on that pathway now, but it hasn't really impacted people. But I think as we think about the next 10 to 20 years, we know that we need to make more fundamental changes that will impact the way people live. So I'm thinking here particularly the difficulty of retrofitting our homes and our buildings so that they have clean heat. That is something that is quite potentially intrusive and could be quite politically challenging. So I think there are other examples as well around our transport systems, our food systems, and I think that just speaks to the fact that we can no longer rely on doing things far away that won't impact people, but we need to really engage people in that transition.
How hopeful do you feel that we will be able to get people across the line in time?
So I feel a bit mixed about this. I mean, I think that right now you'd have to be pretty optimistic to think that the world will meet the Paris Agreement climate change objective of 1.5 degrees of warming. We're simply not on that trajectory. With a bit of luck, global emissions will peak during the next few years and start to reduce. But I think we shouldn't get too obsessed with a specific target, because every fraction of a degree matters, and every action we can take to bend the curve down will really make a difference to what the future looks like and to whether ultimately we can preserve a habitable planet.
So earlier today we had Dr. Lucy Hone, and she talked about the 4 catalysts for change. There was seeing, learning, receiving enough, or hurting enough that we have to change. How much hurt do you think we're going to go through to make the change we need to make?
I think undoubtedly there has been hurt from climate change, and there will be a lot more to come. But I think in terms of motivating people to engage in that change, we do have to present more positive visions of the future as well. And perhaps that's what the initial question was getting at. I answered it in quite a technical way, but actually many of the things that we need to do to decarbonise the economy are also attractive things to do for many other reasons as well. They are nicer places to live, there's safer, warmer homes, there's more green space, there's better natural environment. So the vision potentially of a world where we are successful is a very positive one.
It's one of the really great answers to give somebody who doesn't really believe that we're heading for disaster, isn't it? Is that, well, you know, if I'm wrong, what do we end up with? A cleaner world. Nicer air, cleaner water, all of that sort of thing. So we can't go wrong, really. Who is the onus on to really make and lead this change? Because there's a lot of talk around, well, individuals can't do anything. It needs to be government. It needs to be those big organisations. Is that actually the case?
Yeah, so this conversation I have to say, it sometimes annoys me a little bit because people are pushed into these binary positions about is it the individual or is it structural? And of course, it's both of those things, and structures don't exist without individuals. So I think ultimately, of course, we need governments to act, to set frameworks, but they can only go as far as people will allow them to, at least in democracies. And as an individual, I think we can contribute to structural change. But I think we have to think about our action not just in terms of our personal carbon footprint, but in terms of how we can facilitate a wider structural change. And perhaps that message that I was trying to get across today about net zero, it can't just be seen as the personal sphere. This is about a transformation of the whole economy.
I liked how you sort of ended on a bit of a positive note, saying, we're not doing too badly. We've got the right goals in place. We just need to back it up with the right action. I mean, are you feeling optimistic about those frameworks that we have put in place? Do they need much more work?
I think some of the major progress globally in the last 5 years has been around the fact that we now have frameworks to act. We have the Paris Agreement, a global framework. Countries like New Zealand now have increasingly strong national frameworks. The challenge, I think, now is in the politics of how that translates to action in the real world. So it's can we drive that into real tangible change? Yeah,
we need a policy that just says, just bloody do it. Just do it. Hey, everyone, and Sam, thank you so much. A big round of applause, please, for Sam Friggens.